I vividly remember a conversation that I had with my son Ethan when he was about half his current height, maybe 4 or 5. Sometimes it's easier to date by height rather than by years. But we had a conversation about he had a fear that he had been struggling with that I wanted to help him to push through and overcome. And so I sat down with him and I told him, buddy, it is okay to be afraid. It is fear. It can be is a natural response to something scary, to a danger. It's a natural response, and it's okay to be afraid. But sometimes we have to push through that fear and not allow it to control us or to keep us from doing what we're called to do, what we need to do. And so this is something that is important to push through. And I told him that, everyone struggles with fear to some extent. We're just afraid of different things to different degrees. And I remember he looked back at me and said, "But Dad, you're not afraid of anything." And it struck me, and I said, "Well, of course I'm not. I'm Dad." But I said, "No, buddy, everyone has fears. Everyone faces fears, not just kids, but yes, grown-ups, moms and dads, grandparents, people of all age. We naturally respond in fear to danger. We respond in fear to things that are unknown." And he stopped me and said, "Okay, so what are you afraid of?" But a pointed question I wasn't prepared for. But he said, "What are you afraid of?" And I think he was expecting this big, monster, Godzilla or something like that. And I just responded and said, "Buddy, I have been afraid of not being able to protect you. I have been afraid of not being able to keep you safe at multiple times. And that while it's not just something that kids struggle with, that a child may be worried and concerned and frightened that there might be a boogeyman under their bed or in the closet, or maybe that the tooth fairy forgot about them. But their parents in the next room could be terrified of their crumbling marriage falling apart, of their dying business, of their finances crashing. Grown-ups are also afraid of loss, afraid of rejection, afraid that they're not liked, that they're not loved, that they'll be alone, afraid of deteriorating health. That all of us face fear. We all encounter fear of any age. The question becomes, how are we going to face it? Because we can either allow fear to choke out and strangle our faith and keep us from obedience and keep us from our faith and faithfulness to Jesus, or we can encounter and walk through that and respond to that fear by clinging to Jesus all the tighter, all the more, and letting it push us into Him all the more passionately and closely. And in that process, in that trust in action, that it grows us in ways that comfort never could. And that is what we're talking about this morning as we're looking at faith over fear. We're taking just a brief 1-week break from our sermon series we've been going through in Acts. But actually, we won't go far from there, as we'll be looking at a few short stories in the Gospels that will connect with what we've been looking at. But this weekend, I thought it would be meaningful to actually take just a brief break to talk about fear and how we are to progress through frightening circumstances, clinging to and growing in our faith. One stormy evening out on the lake, Jesus' disciples were terrified as they look out and see what they think is a ghost approaching them. And they cry out in fear as it's coming closer. And let's pick up there in the story in Matthew 14, verse 26. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. And of course, we know this is Jesus walking out to them on this stormy lake in the dark. But they don't recognize that, and they cry out in fear, in terror. Picking up in verse 27, but Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come out to you on the water." And so Jesus walks out to them, and they're terrified, and he immediately responds and tells them to take courage because it is him. And this is similar to virtually any appearance of an angel that we have in the Old Testament, New Testament, that there's this response of great terror and fear, and the angel almost always responds with, "Fear not." And so they are terrified at this sight, terrified at seeing Jesus, where he responds immediately. But it's funny, though, to ask the question of, Jesus already knows that they're going to be terrified. Why in the world does he choose to go out and meet them in this way, in this time and place? It's not like Jesus goes, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know I was going to scare you." Well, you're walking through the waves and through the wind on the water in the deep. How would we not be afraid? But Jesus intentionally does this. In fact, after the feeding of the 5,000, he sends his disciples out ahead of him while he goes up the mountain to pray alone. And then after a time of prayer, he comes down and he goes out to meet them. He could have just waited for them to come back, or he could have gone out with them, but he intentionally sent them ahead. And then knowingly, he walked out to them in the dark, in the lake, with the storm. And there's something about the situation in which this conversation happens that's important, that we'll see. But they cry out in terror, and Jesus immediately responds, tells them to take courage. And Peter's response to Jesus is interesting. It's actually even a little dangerous. He says, "Well, if it's you, if it's truly you, Jesus, then tell me to walk out onto the water with you." It's funny because it has both an aspect of faith and an aspect of fear and a little bit of distrust. They're mixed in together. That there's this faith that if it is you, I trust that you will sustain me, that you will suspend me above the water, that you will keep me safe. If it is you, and you actually allow me to and call me to, I trust that you have the ability to and that you will protect me as I step out in faith in this water. So there is an aspect of faith there, boldness, that Peter is exemplifying there. But there's also a little bit of disbelief, or a little bit of unsureness, that reminds me of Thomas when Thomas says, "It's not enough for me to see it. I need to touch Jesus' wounds before I will accept the truth of his bodily resurrection from the grave. That I need to see it and touch it. That Jesus, this looks like you. You're talking. It's your voice. It sounds like you, but this is hard to wrap my head around. I need to actually step out and feel the water on my feet and reach out and get close enough, presumably, to reach out and touch you." And so Peter responds to this by asking for Jesus to call him out and allow him to safely come to him. Continuing on in verse 29, Jesus does exactly what Peter asked and said, "Come." Then Peter got down out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began, But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." And so Jesus calls him to step out in faith, to put his trust, even though there was a little bit of unsureness mixed in, but to put his trust into action, to step out of the boat and to walk out to him. And Peter takes what seems to be a few steps, but then he has so many distractions pulling his focus off of Jesus. The wind is blowing against him. The waves are crashing into him, and he begins to sink as that fear starts to overtake his faith. And immediately, in verse 31, again, this word immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him and said, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down, and then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." So again, he immediately rescues him from sinking into this lake and pulls him back to safety. But why did Jesus go through all of this? This conversation that they were going to have, couldn't he just have it much more easily out on the shore, in the shallow, in the light of day? Why have it out in the unsafe, terrifying, deep, dark, stormy waters of the lake? Jesus knows how he's going to respond, that he's going to be terrified. He knows that he is going to have some faith, but then he's going to struggle. Jesus is doing something, is showing something to Peter and his disciples and challenging them in a way that doesn't work in the safety of the shallow, that doesn't work in the comfort of the boat or in the light of day on the beach, but that Jesus is going out and calling them to trust in me even in the storm, even in the dark, even when the ground beneath your feet is unstable, even when you're not sure and the waves are crashing against you and the wind is trying to knock you over. I want you to step out in faith and trust me. It's hard to read this story and not also think about the time when Jesus is also out on the lake with his disciples, and there's a great storm comes. And the disciples are terrified as the waves are getting bigger and the boat's actually taking on water. And they are terrified. And what is Jesus doing this whole time? He's sleeping. He is sleeping. And I love this detail that Mark gives us in his narration of the event. Jesus is sleeping on a cushion. He's resting on a comfortable cushion. Meanwhile, the chaos all around, the boat is rocking, taking on water. They're terrified for their lives, and Jesus is comfortably, peacefully at rest. And they wake him up. And let's pick up there. I don't want to get too excited to ruin it. So they wake him up and they say, "Don't you care? Don't you care that we are perishing? We are dying. Don't you see? Don't you care? Literally, why don't you care that we are perishing?" And Jesus gets up and responds in verse 39. He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Hush." The raindrops really add to that, don't they? I planned that. "Be still." And the wind died down and became perfectly calm. And he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? And they became very much afraid and said to one another, I love this, "Who is this who even the wind and the waves, even the wind and the sea obey him? Who is this that even nature, even the chaotic sea obeys him and his command, that he could just hush and it dies in an instant? Who is this?" And so it's almost a comical scenario of this chaos and terror and fright, and then Jesus is just calm and peaceful. But he gets up and quickly and decisively stops it and exercises and shows who he is and his authority and his power. But why did Jesus allow this to get out of control to begin with? Is it that he just, you know what, I was going to stop this earlier, but I was having this great dream, and, you know, I was so restful. I stayed up late with this trunk or treat event last night. But no, Jesus is intentional. He is highly intentional and strategic. And that he allows it to get to this point to where their faith is challenged. And they're wrestling with this. Don't you care? Where are you at? What are you doing? But again, what he wants to do for his disciples couldn't be accomplished on that calm sea in the comfort of the daylight, but that he allows them to wrestle and struggle in this scenario, to challenge them to step out in faith, to stand up and to walk in their fear, to walk towards him faithfully, to lean into him. It's one thing to trust him on that shoreline. It's one thing to trust him when the sun's shining and everything is just great. It's something else to say, my boat is cracking at the seams. I am perishing. Where are you, Jesus? But yet I will step out of this boat where you tell me I will leap and I will go even though I am afraid. I am terrified. But I will trust you because you are the God who can speak one word and all of creation it blows up and expounds. It is beautiful and functional. It is good. The same one who can speak into creation can speak one word and hush and still the craziest storms I find myself in. Have you ever felt like have you ever wondered how many times Jesus has said those words to you of, why did you have so little faith? Why did you doubt? I know when I read this, I wonder that, like, Jesus, how many times have you directed those words to me? After all that he has done in my life, after all he has done in history of who he is, yet still, once the waves start coming up over the boat, once that wind starts knocking me over, once I find myself in that scenario, Jesus, where are you at? Why are you sleeping? That our faith is challenged. But that it's challenged to push us to cling to him all the more, all the tighter, to trust and hope in him, to grow in our faith, even through fear. And when we do that, we'll be amazed to see what he does in us and through us and in our situations. That the word in Greek for being amazed, astounded, or to marvel at is used as you would expect all over the Gospels and even in Acts. Thaumazo is the Greek word. It is used, but it's as you would expect, it's almost always used of people being amazed at Jesus, amazed at his teaching, at his miracles, amazed at his disciples' teaching and miracles. But there are 2 times in the Gospels, 2 times in all the New Testament, 2 times they're both in the Gospels, where Jesus is the subject of the verbal action of thaumazo, of being amazed. And I want to take a look briefly at these 2 short stories as they'll add to our message this morning. The first is in Luke chapter 7, where Luke tells us about this Roman centurion, highly unlikely candidate for someone to respond to Jesus positively. But this Roman centurion has a servant, not just a servant that he's concerned about. The servant is sick and is almost to the point of death. And it's not that, okay, you know what, the centurion's worried about the economic loss that might, that the servant's not working, or if he passes, then who's going to take care of my household? Or he is deeply concerned about his servant, who is a loved part of his family. It seems that this is someone he cares about deeply, and so he sends some Jewish elders to go and approach Jesus and to beg Jesus to come and to heal his servant. And so these Jewish elders go and they tell Jesus he's a good man. He loves our nation. He loves the nation of Israel, and he even built our synagogue. And they plead with him to come and heal his servant. And so Jesus goes with them. Let's pick up there in Luke 7, verse 6. Now Jesus started on his way with them, and when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to Jesus, "Lord, do not trouble yourself further, for I am not worthy for you to come under my roof. For this reason, I didn't even consider myself worthy to come to you. But just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man placed under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes. And to my slave, do this, and he does it." And so, at first, in reading the story, initially you have to wonder, why is he not going to see Jesus directly? If he really cares about this servant so much, why is he just sending other people to go to Jesus instead of doing it himself? Maybe he doesn't really care that much, or maybe he doesn't. He thinks his time is too valuable to take the time to go himself. It's easier just to send someone else. But as we read on, we see that quite the opposite is the case, that he doesn't go directly, not because he doesn't care as much or because he thinks he's too important, but he doesn't go because he feels so unworthy to come before Jesus. And so he sends people to Jesus who he thinks are more worthy of Jesus' time than his own. I am not worthy to come before you. I am not worthy for you to come into my home. And so you see this great humility that he expresses in telling Jesus how unworthy he is of Jesus. But then you also see this great faith where he says, you don't even have to come into my home. You don't even have to step foot in my home. Just say the word, and my servant will be healed. All you have to do is say the word. And with that, let's pick up there in verse 9. When Jesus heard this, he marveled at him. This is the same word, thaumazo. He marveled at him. He was amazed by him. He was astounded by the centurion's faith. And he turned and said to the crowd that was following him, I say to you, not even in Israel have I found such great faith. When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. And to stop and recognize the same word to describe the crowds marveling at Jesus' great miracles and authoritative teaching, that same word is used to describe Jesus' response to this faith, the faith of this unlikely one to accept and respond to Jesus positively, not just a Gentile, but a Roman centurion. And that Jesus was amazed at his great faith. The next scenario I want to look at, the second, where we see Jesus as the subject of this verbal action, is found in Mark 6. Let's go ahead and read verses 1 and 2. Jesus went out from there and came into his hometown, and his disciples followed him. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many listeners were astonished, saying, where did this man get these things? And what is this wisdom given to him? And such miracles are being performed by his hands. Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. You're reading that, and it sounds like they're amazed at Jesus, and they're responding positively, and wow, they're marveled at his teaching, and where did he get this? And he wasn't trained, he wasn't educated to be able to teach this way, to know this, and to have this authority and power in his teaching. And they've heard about these great miracles that are validating his message, but then this last phrase, they took offense at him, is puzzling. But then when we see that it's because they can't see Jesus as anything more than a carpenter's son, a lowly, untrained carpenter's son. Wait a minute, Jesus' own brothers don't believe in him. Why in the world should we? We know his family. We know them well. And so they have Jesus, they have the truth, they have the powerful teaching and the validating signs and wonders that they've heard of, and they reject it all. And in response, that leads us to verse 6, and Jesus wondered, he marveled, he was astounded, he was amazed. The same Greek word, thaumazo, he was amazed at their unbelief. And he was going around the villages teaching. He was amazed, that same amazement and astonishment at the centurion's great faith, the same amazement people have about him. He is amazed at their unbelief, their refusal to accept what's right before them. And we see that faith matters to Jesus. And Hebrews 11 tells us it's impossible to please God without faith. But faith isn't just, and it's important to understand this, that faith, the English word faith, sometimes we think of as just being a knowledge or just a belief, like it's something just in the abstract that it may not connect with our lives. But the Greek word pistis, which is translated as faith, means trust. It's an active word God calls us to trust him, not just to know him or know about him, but to actually trust him. It results in action. And that's why, James says, even the demons believe that God is one. Their problem is not knowledge or belief. Their problem is their response to that truth. We are called to, yes, understand his truth, but to respond in trusting him, in a loving relationship with him. And that's going to result in us living out that faith. Now, we're saved by by God's grace through faith. I want to make sure that is very clear. We are not saved by deeds. However, we are called to a faith beyond empty words, but to actually trust God, even when our boat is taking on water, even when we're in those storms. Even when Jesus doesn't look to be engaged or involved in what's going on, when he's sleeping on that cushion amidst our storm. He calls us to fully trust him and push into him all the more when we find ourselves going through doubt and going through fear. I want to just very briefly tell one final short story that for me has helped me when I have struggled with doubt. You might say, well, this all sounds fine and good, but I can't understand where God is or what he's doing. I just can't put these two things together, that God is powerful and good and loving, and I'm going through this. Well, I want to just very briefly look at a scenario in Mark 9 where a man is desperate to save his son, and that he tells Jesus that his son is possessed by a demon and keeps being thrown to the ground and even thrown into the fire, and that he took his son to the disciples and they were unable to cast it out. They were unable to rescue him. And so he was desperate at this point, desperate and terrified for his son's safety, for his life, for his salvation. He's terrified for his son. And so in Mark 9, verse 23, Jesus said, he asked Jesus, will you rescue my son? If you are willing, will you save him? And Jesus responds in verse 23, if I can, picking up on the way he phrased the question, he says, all things are possible to him who believes. And immediately the boy's father cried out, I believe, help my unbelief. I believe, help my unbelief. And Jesus doesn't respond to that, saying, that's not good enough. You know, you need to have more faith. I need 100%, no doubts. You can't struggle, or I'm just not even going to listen to you. Jesus responds to that honesty, to that transparency, and saying, God, Jesus, I'm trying, I have faith, but I'm struggling with it. I believe, but would you help my unbelief? And Jesus responds in compassion, and he casts out the demon and commands it not only to leave, but to never enter him again. And that Jesus answers that and responds to that broken, honest request that I believe, but would you help my unbelief? And sometimes when you find yourself in that scenario of the ground beneath my feet is breaking, I am so terrified, and I don't see you moving around me. I have no idea how you are working in or through this or what you're doing. But God, to be open and honest and trust him and just say, I believe, but I'm wrestling and struggling with my faith. And so I want to challenge you to be open and honest and transparent with him as you may struggle to step out in faith, as you may struggle with the valleys that you encounter in life, to trust him and to be open and honest when you struggle to trust him. And when we do that and we step out in faith, that God will not only move in that situation, but he'll grow us and challenge us through those difficult times. Would you bow with me as we pray? Lord, we come before you. And God, we thank you for being the God who is there, even when we don't see it, even when we don't feel it, even when we're wrestling and struggling to understand it. Lord, you are there, right there with us, ready for us to call on your name, ready for us to step out in faith, and that you are calling us to put that faith that we might talk about into action as we step out and trust you fully. And God, maybe some here this morning are right there in that boat, or right there, and the boat is cracking and falling apart, and they're sinking. Lord, I ask that you would make yourself evident in their situation, right where they're at, and this morning that you would give them the courage to step out in whatever you might be calling them to do, to give them that courage and strength. Lord, would you give us a faith that will withstand and weather those storms, a faith that will challenge and inspire those around us that we don't even know are watching us. Would you bless us as we seek to be faithful even amidst those storms? It's in your name that we pray. Amen.